Thanks, Kristen, and thanks for that run through. And as you said, it is a skim through the report, and there is much more to it for those who want a more detailed version or a more detailed presentation. I'm just going to host a panel session between the three of us, just to keep things simple. The questions are largely based on ones that we've been asked already, and they've been asked of us by the media, as members of the media have seen parts of this report, and you may have seen the article in Business News, and also questions that have been asked of us by a number of leading mining companies who have also had some early insight into the report and how it works for them. So the questions are ones that we've addressed already, but I think they're of importance, so we'll ask them again. And of course, if you do have questions down the track, any one of the three of us are more than happy to discuss the report with you and provide answers. So Kristen, I might start with you. Can you just give us your view as to whether the report really is an accurate insight into the view of employees in the mining industry? Perhaps given the sample size, start there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it is definitely an accurate representation. I think, as I mentioned when I was walking through the presentation, we often hear numbers for surveys bandied around at the sort of 1,000 mark, but you know, that's 1,000 people across Australia for general population. So given we're talking about a very specific part of the workforce here, we're talking about one individual sector and we're talking about state-specific insights, I think we can have a lot of confidence in the research results that we've managed to gather. The other thing is that we did take a holistic view. So we didn't just look at employees, we also looked at contractors, so workers engaged by both mining companies and the companies contracting to them. We looked at, as we've mentioned, residential, FIFO, Dido and Metro as well. So we had not just a narrow view. While we did have a lot of the sample were FIFO workers, we did manage to gather insights from outside of that as well, which does give us a view on the different role types as well.
And just to follow on from that, do you think it was an informed audience? Were they actually an audience that understood the mining industry, or in the case of the answers to I don't know what the benefits were or are, they're not an informed audience?
No, so they're definitely predominantly an informed audience. We didn't set out to specifically survey an informed audience, but we just found that in the sample that came back, around 2/3 of those are currently working in the industry. So while we did have, as I said, those ex-industry workers and the partners, the majority are currently working in the industry now. And we also found that around 7 in 10 have actually been in the industry for 6 years or more, with around half of those being in the industry for 10 years or more. So I think we can say that given this is an audience who have spent quite a long time working in this sector, their feedback is coming from a position of knowledge and from experience across potentially multiple companies, and from a long time working in the sector, potentially in different roles. So I think that gives us some confidence that they are really basing this on experience, and again, that these are long-term sort of benefits that they're after, not necessarily a reflection of a point in time. The other thing I was going to mention, Anthony, as well about is an accurate representation, is that we also feel that the value of this research will grow over time. So we do intend to conduct this next year as an annual report, and that provides an opportunity to deep dive into specific areas, but also is going to give us that longitudinal data that will allow us to see how are trends changing over time in terms of workforce needs and how they are evolving. So I think that value will grow. It's still highly valuable now to give us those insights on where we sit in 2020, but as we move forward, we're also going to gather even more kind of robust insights around how that's changing and morphing for people working in the sector.
All right, and perhaps to segue off that, I mean, Danny is someone with a lot of practical experience in recruiting in the sector. This question as to whether the report is still valid or has changed because of the COVID-19 experience. From what you're seeing, we had a short, sharp COVID experience here in the grand scheme of things. Definitely. Is what people told us back in January and February still valid now? Has the world changed a lot?
Absolutely. I think we really just had a sort of a 4 to 6 week time frame where we were sort of in limbo, and we've come out of that we're seeing these companies that have moved to those longer rosters of a 4 and 2 and a 2 and 2 moving back to the 2 and 1 and the 8 and 6. Not everybody, but a lot of them. I also think that, you know, when we were ready to launch was when we were right in the middle of that sort of beginning of COVID, and we all were in lockdown. So I think the relevance to the information that we obtained pre-COVID is definitely, you know, is where we're at right now. Clearly the rosters will remain a large issue. You know, for years and years we've fought family-friendly rosters just because it is a nice to have, and it is essential in our industry to maintain employees. And interestingly enough, you know, having also been gifted answers, I suppose, by previous mining candidates and employees, you know, it's interesting to share that knowledge, I think, with the rest of the sector as well around that whole recruitment and retention strategy. But yeah, without a doubt, you know, we're in a really good position right now, and let's hope that that remains, and that we are, I believe, and the trends that we're seeing is that employment is starting to pick up again from both a contract and a permanent perspective.
So there's a lot in this report, and the presentation we've done today really just actually does skim the surface. Mm-hmm. But even on what's been presented here, as a person recruiting in the sector, what would be the number 1 or 2 points that you'd be making to either a mining company or a contractor from this report? What should they focus on? I mean, you've mentioned rosters just then.
Yeah, I think the greatest thing out of this report is that we haven't focused on Rem and Ben, which is what most reports and surveys focus on, and that's where a lot of companies get their data from. So we're looking at, you know, the fact that people want a decent night's sleep. I mean, if that's not a given, that really needs to be at the forefront of your mind to implement. That's not a very expensive thing for companies to take on board. And, you know, perhaps they should be looking at, you know, supporting families and their partners a little bit more as well. I think that's been a really interesting thing to come out of the report too. Training and career development, like I said, has been at the forefront for a long, long time, and it will remain. And those companies that really do see the benefit in that are going to benefit themselves in retention.
I might just throw to you now, Anthony, in terms of, you know, I guess you did touch on this earlier, but how do you think companies can effectively communicate to employees and prospects all the aspects of working in the sector that appear to be important to them?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, if we leave aside the salary issue, which is relatively straightforward to communicate when recruiting, what this report does is actually start to hone for people, I think, the areas in which they need to communicate. My feeling is that for a long time it's been a bit of a guesswork and a bit of open slather as to what it is that you were trying to communicate to make you stand apart. I think this report actually really starts to enable companies to focus in. The reality is you can't communicate everything at once. So there is a prioritisation of information. And every company is going to feel that it has its own particular strengths to play to. So it may well be, for example, that you actually do have an accommodation camp that is completely new, that the accommodation is spread apart, it's well laid out, that you actually can demonstrate that you can get a fantastic night's sleep. And that is the thing that you prioritise and play to as your strength. By the same token, it may be that there are companies with slightly older accommodation, that's not their immediate strength. But the one thing that they can do is demonstrate that when they tell people there is a career pathway, they stick to it. Because there are certainly many companies we know that will actually make promises around career pathways, and then for a variety of reasons are unable to actually fulfill that promise. So I think for me, the main thing out of this is it hones where and what you need to communicate, and then each company should actually say, right, my priority and my point of difference is in this area, and that's what they start to build communications campaigns around. And, you know, that's what their brand starts to become known for.
So assuming that you're a company that you've validated with your workforce that a good night's sleep is indeed what's really critical for your workforce, you know, beds and curtains are not particularly sexy. You know, what would be your advice on how to kind of communicate that in an interesting way?
Sure. Look, again, I do think this is really quite fascinating. I've been working in the sector for 20 years and assisting with recruitment communications. And I must admit, the one thing I've pretty much never had to communicate around is beds, curtains, good night's sleep. If you think about it, more typically it is literally focused on pools, gyms, and food, of course, has become one in recent years. And, you know, there's a wide range of food products now being made available to employees. But that whole bed, good night's sleep, I think to a large degree has been under the radar. How do you communicate it? You know, as a creative agency, there are a number of different ways of doing it. As I indicated before, I wouldn't rule out humour and levity. Sometimes you actually do need to attack a subject with humour. But the one thing I would say is that I would borrow techniques from the retail industry. You know, at the end of the day, there are companies that are very good at selling beds, and there are companies that are very good at selling curtains. And I would actually start to look at some of their techniques. There's a whole range of things. You know, there are rating systems, there's review systems, there's anecdotal evidence, you know, there's storytelling around it. I think there is a lot of ways that if you genuinely think that you can offer your worker a good night's sleep, that you can make that part of a recruitment and retention campaign, as long as it's true. It's got to be authentic. All right, so Chris, I might just track back to you. In the report, could you actually see a substantial difference in the opinions between FIFO employees and those who are residential?
Yeah, so in terms of the amenities they want, not particularly. So across the board, things like connection, so Wi-Fi and mobile coverage were really critical. Likewise, food selection, so shops for FIFO workers, supermarkets for residential were important to both, and more so than some of those other amenities. As you would expect probably from people who are living in these remote and regional communities, the infrastructure of the town does play a bigger part. And interestingly, we also heard comments from people in the verbatim in the report around the importance of, for residential workers, childcare facilities, mothers groups, and also access to nannies, because someone mentioned that, you know, the childcare hours don't necessarily align with the shifts that they're working. So having access to that broader, again, that feeds into that access to the family network of family support was more important to those residential workers. Where we did see some quite big differences were in regards to the challenges faced by the different FIFO versus residential, and what was actually making them consider leaving their role. So we found that FIFO workers were almost 4 times as likely to cite financial challenges as a driver for them to be considering leaving. Residential workers, on the other hand, were more likely to say health challenges such as mental health or physical health. So we also found that residential workers were almost twice as likely to say that difficulties relating to their partner and children were making them consider leaving. So again, that just feeds into that family package, particularly for residential. And then interestingly, from a career development perspective, we found that, you know, when we talk about PD and career pathways, they did come through as more important to residential workers than FIFO. And I think that probably speaks to the fact that, you know, if you're going to you know, up and move your entire family to a new location, you want to really see that that company is investing back in you to make that worthwhile.
So Danny, a question for you now. If you had a competitive salary for the role and you implemented many of the things that this report is telling us, are you then reaching the perfect recruitment package? Are you heading towards perfection for what people want?
I'm not sure if there is a perfect recruitment package because it is dependent on location. It is dependent on residential versus FIFO. There's so many different elements to it. And in our sector, as we know, there's so many ebbs and flows too. You know, we go through boom and bust cycles all the time, or quite often anyhow. So I think this information is definitely something, like I said before, that mining companies need to take on board, but and gives us greater clarity than just the remuneration and specific benefits that, you know, most people are offered anyhow as that dangling carrot to take a role. But I really do think that the data clearly shows there has to be more done in the future to be able to recruit and retain, and especially retain your existing workforce. I think is really going to be where it's at for the mining and resources sector.
Might throw one back at you, Anthony. So, I mean, there's obviously this continued evolution of technology. Is there a best way of communicating with your staff in this digital age?
Well, I mean, it's fairly obvious there's a continuing evolution in technology, because just look at the way that we're presenting this webinar. When we first started this process, we were going to have an industry lunch. So that alone proves the rapid evolution. Look, I think everyone's now fully aware that there are multiple channels for reaching people, and that we all actually have to use all those channels. It's no longer as if social media is a nice to have, and yet you can still reach people through newspaper advertising. So as hard as it is, companies have basically got to use all the channels that they can and use them all the time, particularly in a tight recruiting environment. I think the key thing is really the storytelling aspect of it. Most communications has now moved on from the notion that you can tell people what to think. And I think in this space, you can't tell people what to think. You can't tell people that there is a great talent pathway. You can't tell people that there is a great bet and have them believe those things. There's too many ways of actually establishing whether it's true or not. So for me, the key thing is you need to use all the different channels at your disposal, particularly the digital ones, because they reach people directly. But you've got to tell a story. You've got to tell a really authentic story about your company, your contracting organisation, that covers off some of the bases that we've been seeing here today. How you tell the stories, well, obviously the easiest way is going to be if you've got advocates for you, which are most likely to be your current employees. So in many ways, your current employees become more critical by the day, because they are really the only ones who can actually say, yes, I get a good night's sleep, and be believed.
Absolutely. I think that authenticity point is really important. You can't say you're doing something that you're not. It's just going to have the opposite impact, isn't it?
All right, so look, we might just do a couple of last questions. So last one to you, Kristen. Anything that surprised you in the results? You were on this for a couple of months. At the end of the day, did you get a shock?
Yeah, there's always little things that surprise you in research. Look, I think from the perspective of the desire for flexibility around rosters and even time rosters, that didn't surprise me. That has been confirmed in past research we've done for companies, that's the direction that people are sort of moving towards, wanting shorter rosters. However, I was probably surprised at the level of influence or impact that small things like good healthy food options and a good coffee. I mean, I'm a tea drinker myself, but I know that caffeine is important to people. So really just the fact that some of those basic things that companies can do can actually have an even bigger impact than the big investments was quite surprising to me. And I also was very surprised about that disconnect between the partners and the workers, because I probably would have perceived that more partners would have been telling us that they were unhappy with the working arrangements of the worker, but in actual fact, for the most part, people were either ambivalent or okay with it. So that disconnect I found quite interesting and surprising as well.
So Danny, I'm going to come to you on that, because I must admit that was the one that I found most surprising in the research as well. I think typically we assume that the partner, particularly perhaps based in Perth, is having a tough time of it when their partner is away. That may not appear to be the case here, and probably actually is worthy of further research by us as well. It begs the question, is there a role for companies or not in helping address this problem? Or is this simply a relationship problem that is best left to others?
I think it's actually a combined effort. I think it's obviously the worker who works away, the person who's at home, and also the company. And a few years ago, there was some really interesting support services around FIFO families. You know, we see companies that take their partners and their children up to site for family days. I think that still needs to be implemented so that, you know, the families get to understand exactly where mum and dad work away too. But interestingly enough, I feel as a FIFO wife, as somebody who's on so many forums and pages and groups, there is a lot of support around for the particular partners that are at home, for them, you know, on social media, and social media plays such a big impact in our day-to-day life, as you just mentioned, Anthony. So you know, having a more inclusive scenario from a mining and contract services company around the partner and children, I think would definitely benefit them as, again, a retention strategy. We're not necessarily just talking about recruitment here. We are talking about retention because of the cost involved. But yeah, I think I personally, as somebody who was FIFO many, many moons ago, I think we're really fortunate as partners that we do have some support mechanisms if we feel that we can reach out to them direct too, because often there's people that, you know, that's just not something that they can do.
All right. Well, look, thanks very much, Danny. I think on the basis that we're almost at 1 o'clock, we might call it there. There's a number of questions and we could keep going. So I'd like to thank both Danny and Kristen for joining me today, and particularly Kristen for running us through the results of the research. As we said at the beginning, it is a skim through the research. There is a lot more to it, and there is a very detailed document if people are interested in it. Above and beyond that, if people would just like a general discussion with any one of the three of us, we're more than happy to do that at any time. We will be presenting to a number of companies through the industry over the coming weeks, and it may even be that we come across some of the people listening in on this webinar. But thanks to everyone for giving up an hour of your time, and thanks to my co-hosts, and we'll see you all soon.